This video will deal with flexible working methods. There are different types of flexibility used by organizations in the context of the use and deployment of their labor force. We can identify, for example, functional flexibility, where workers are used within particular functional tasks, perhaps because of their skills or their training or their interests, but also perhaps looking at moving operators and employees from one particular set of functions to another and having retraining programs and just generally getting flexibility within the function. We can also identify numerical flexibility, trying to adjust the total size of the labour force, perhaps according to seasonal demand for the company's product. We have temporal flexibility, looking at particular time slots when more workers are required, or particular functions may need extra personnel which will have to be drafted in perhaps from other departments. Looking at very temporary situations, but nonetheless ones which need to be fulfilled. Locational flexibility, perhaps the organisation runs on different sites and may have to have some means of moving operators and employees from one site to another. And financial flexibility, having reserves to meet any contingency expenditures or unanticipated expenditures, or perhaps to fund certain investment projects, perhaps small scale investment projects, but nonetheless ones which will facilitate productivity. So organizations adopt different types of flexibility and use different working methods to achieve outcomes. Most organizations have some element of flexibility built into their procedures in terms of employing staff on different contracts or for different time periods and so on. So it's quite a wide-scale practice. Part-time contracts, well, these are probably the most common type of flexible working method. The method is associated with numerical flexibility. It's part-time, so the organisation can take on part-time staff at certain time periods, and perhaps when the demand is less, the part-time staff are no longer required. The part-time staff would then be let go. But generally speaking, part-time work should be to the advantage of both sides of the contract, to the worker and to the organisation. Some workers want part-time work because of various personal commitments, perhaps family commitments. In the UK, most of the part-time work is done by females. Again, this reflects in a sense, the burden that the female population have got in terms of family responsibility, children, schools and so on, and they need to have the flexibility to work part-time and perhaps attend the workplace if required for particular time periods, which enables them to meet their other obligations. Some organisations rely on part-time employment as it's considered cost-effective and has greater flexibility in shift work. So some organisations like the idea of this type of flexibility, like the idea of part-time employment, because it's more cost-effective. The burden on the payroll is not that much, but at the same time the organisation has flexibility and is able to introduce shift work for people who want to perhaps work in the evenings, or some people might want to work at night, or some people want to work in the morning. So it's able to introduce different shifts and have workers come in at different times. In 2001, the government in the UK, that is, implemented the EU Part-time Workers Directive. Now, the focus of the legislation is to ensure that anybody working part-time does not face discrimination. So there are rules and directives related to the employment of part-time staff. The sector is controlled. Now, the common reason for part-time employment, well, to recruit staff during times of labour shortage. Sometimes if the company is working at full capacity, and perhaps other companies are also in the area working at full capacity, it may be difficult to recruit staff. So offering part-time employment may be attractive to some. They don't want to work full-time. Again, as I said earlier, perhaps for family reasons, and we'll meet this later. So perhaps it gives the flexibility to the labour force and to the organisation, but enables the organisation to get staff. Sometimes the employees request this. For example, female staff wish to go part-time when returning after maternity leave. They've got the duties to look after a newborn child. They've also got perhaps obligations to the family or to other commitments, and they want to have that flexibility. So sometimes workers request part-time work. The main benefits of part-time employment, well, it reduces costs, as employees I should say, only work when required. The organisation has much more flexibility in the way it uses labour. It may require people to work perhaps 3 evenings a week rather than 4, or it might ask them to work 6 evenings a week. It all depends. They may have to pay more to induce the workers to attend the extra nights, but it does give flexibility, and because of that, the employers are able to perhaps reduce the costs of employees. It also enables an organisation to attract staff with specialist skills who are unable to work full-time due to other commitments. We know in the UK, for example, now the majority, I think, of university students are female. Well, it would be a tragic waste of a resource if those people could not use their skills in industry and commerce and in the service sector, in manufacturing, engineering, and in all the plethora of ways in which they have studied. So companies can tap into a rich source of labour, a skilled labour force. They want to work part-time because of commitments, but they have got a lot of skills. Employment of retired people also is attractive to companies. People who retire with life skills and also specific skills to particular tasks, and have a wealth of experience. So companies who can get older workers who have retired and attract them back into the labour force, those companies are likely to benefit significantly from the employment of those people. And students can benefit because students can get skills and experiences from working part-time. A lot of people, when they think about student employment, they think about low-grade jobs, working in restaurants or working in bars or whatever. In fact, there are opportunities, at least the evidence seems to suggest there are opportunities for placements within organisations on a part-time basis, where students can get skills from working part-time. Now, I know there's a big regional difference in this, and it varies from one part of the country to the next, and it depends on the type of sectors in that particular community, in that particular region. But there are perhaps opportunities for students to gain skills and experiences through part-time working, and certainly colleges and universities appreciate these type of skills when students apply for courses. Some drawbacks of part-time employment. Well, part-timers may not show commitment compared to other obligations. Clearly, part-time workers, their minds may still be at home. They may be still occupied by something they were doing before they came to work, or perhaps something that they're going to do when they leave work that evening or that afternoon. So they're not showing the same commitment to the job. There might be an issue of quality and quality control when part-time workers are involved. Perhaps the monitoring of work needs to be more intense and more precise to make sure that standards are upheld and that part-time workers understand the importance of quality and so on. It may be inflexible when needed for overtime. So sometimes part-time workers are reluctant to do overtime. They think they're going to do 20 hours a week and they don't want to do any more. That's because they've got a balance. They've got obligations outside. So they don't want to take on extra work and work overtime. They don't want to work more than their 20 hours or whatever they've contracted for. So they can be inflexible about working extra. Also, there is an element of cost here in terms of training, especially when 2 or 3 part-timers are employed to carry out the job for one. So one worker perhaps working 40 hours a week, it might be the same as, well, let's keep it easy, 2 workers working 20 hours a week each. But the 2 workers have to be trained. So it's doubling the numbers who have to be trained. If one worker does it and works 40 hours a week, one person has to be trained. If 2 are working for 20 hours each to cover the same job, the same task, then 2 workers would have to be trained, and that can be more expensive. Now, temporary contracts. Well, temporary employment is also another form of numerical flexibility, trying to get the numbers right. This type of employment occurs when an employee is employed for a fixed term, usually as cover or it could be something related to a particular project. So let's say some worker leaves the organization, perhaps a worker leaves on maternity leave. Then a temporary contract could be issued for someone to come in and do the work for the period of time that the worker was away. It's temporary. It's a temporary fix, and it applies to a particular time period. Employees can be employed on a fixed term or seasonal basis to focus on a specific job. It doesn't have to be that they're covering for someone who's away. It could be that the organisation has seasonal demand. For example, agricultural production. Then perhaps workers are only employed for certain times of the year and they have temporary contracts, just covering that particular time period. In the UK, temporary employment takes place during peak times. For example, Christmas temps, people looking for jobs over the Christmas period. Extra postmen are required to deliver the extra postal burden. Also during summer vacations, people may be required for work in seaside resorts, for example. Temporary employment is also reliant on economic conditions and labour demand. So the overarching determinant of the labour demand is the economy. But within that, there can be seasonal demand and there can be temporary employment in certain times of the year due to certain circumstances. For example, Christmas, as I said. Temporary contracts benefit employers as they can determine staff needs and renew contracts according to demand. It's easier to lay off temporary staff, then organise staff redundancies. So organisations find temporary staff easier to deal with. Making personnel redundant is complicated, it's costly, and it's never nice. People are losing their jobs. Temporary staff may have other obligations, they may have other interests. It may be to their advantage to have a temporary contract and work just for several months of the year and do something else for the rest of the time. It all depends on personal circumstances, and it's difficult to generalize. But certainly it's the case that companies find dealing with temporary staff easier than full-time staff. Now, the purpose for recruiting temporary staff will provide short-term cover, for example, as I said, maternity or sick cover when people are away ill. Trying to match staffing levels in times of demand. When the company is working flat out and has a lot of orders on its books, they may need temporary staff to try to meet the extra demand. So staffing levels are increased. There can also be temporary staff to accommodate one-off tasks and project work. Sometimes organisations start projects, and the projects may have labour requirements, and to facilitate that, and so as not to take away workers from other perhaps more established tasks, so as not to take the workers away from there, temporary workers may be employed to work on this particular project. Generally speaking, it's easier to recruit temporary staff. Temporary staff look at the terms of the employment and know what their obligations are, and they're quite interested in taking employment for that period. It does reduce labour costs because the temporary staff are only employed for the time period where there is an absolute need for their presence. And when that need no longer exists, the temporary staff are not required. They also can bring specialist skills. Temporary staff can be attractive because of their skills. I mentioned earlier the large numbers of people who have been to college and universities and have acquired skills, and perhaps then because of family obligations or children, school requirements and so on, they have left the labour force. But perhaps from time to time they want to go back and get some money to augment the family income. But these people are highly skilled, some of them. They have been to college and universities, and they've got immense skills. So the temporary staff that's recruited could be very highly skilled. They may be slightly out of date because they haven't kept their skills up to date, but within a short space of time the company could find that the temporary staff that are employed on this basis become very productive indeed. Subcontractors. Well, organisations employ subcontractors as consultants or self-employed agencies. Again, it's flexible working. They subcontract part of their tasks to others to complete. It's introducing flexibility for them. The aim of subcontractors is to take on specific jobs for the organisation. The jobs can be long-term, short-term, or on a frequent basis. So the contractors come in to take on specific jobs, jobs that are identified as suitable for subcontracting. For example, caterers, cleaners, security, jobs are carried out from other companies. So a company will need to have cleaners in. Well, instead of employing the cleaners itself, it subcontracts it. It gets in another company who supply that service. The same for security officers and security guards. Subcontractors may be useful when specialist skills are required. This is much cheaper than to train employees for the task. If a particular task requires a high degree of specialism and perhaps it's only a one-off because of the nature of the particular job or the particular order the company has got, it might be better to subcontract that than to try and train operators within the company to do the job. It may be much cheaper to subcontract it off to other companies. External agencies and employers have their own employees. Therefore, the organisation does not have to account for additional staff. So the external agencies and employers have their own employees. It's just a question of one company, in a sense, outsourcing the work, subcontracting it, outsourcing it to another company who will take on all of the issues associated with that particular task and deliver it to the company. The drawback of self-contractors is that they may show a lack of commitment. They do not have any long-term interest in the organisation. They are there to perform particular tasks. That's all. They don't go beyond that. That's not a part of their contract, and to go beyond it would eat into their benefits, eat into their profitability. So the subcontractors will do precisely what is contracted. So they don't have commitment. Home working. Well, home working has grown in interest, especially with organisations such as the Avon Cosmetics and female representatives. Avon probably popularised it in the UK. Avon ladies travelling to other people's houses and demonstrating the products of the company and having parties with their customers and so on. This kicked off the idea that it was possible to work from home, and Avon popularised that. The company Avon popularised it. But now we have home working for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is the internet and the possibility of working from home because of better communication systems. So telecommunications is essential in the modern workforce. Employees can easily keep in contact with their employers and work colleagues due to the technology. It's possible to have not just emails but teleconferencing and video conferencing and sending sound files and graphics, and it's more possible to work from home, which means a lot of saving for the employee. They don't have to battle the traffic to try and get to work and find a car parking space and go through all the hassle again returning from work, facing the traffic in the opposite direction. There are many advantages out of home working, and the technology now enables this to happen, so it's becoming more popular. The employers benefit from home working as it reduces costs. For example, a reduction in premises saves on rent, business rates, heating, lighting costs. In effect, the person works from home, so the company does not have to have a specific office or doesn't have to have all the facilities of the office and heat the office and so on. So it's cheaper for the employer. The employees may suffer from low morale and commitment and motivation as there's no work routine and there is isolation. So sometimes people go to work because there's a social side to work. They like to meet their colleagues and talk about the job and talk about sport and what was on television, and it's a social place. It's a place where people interact. And working on their own, perhaps at home, can lead to isolation and low morale. So there are issues about working at home that are bad and need to be looked into. Employers have to opt for other forms of performance management, monitoring of product quality and regular meetings and inspections. The employer doesn't know when the employee starts work. It's not 9 to 5. The employee might start work at 10 o'clock in the morning and may work until 7 in the evening. No one sees this. So the employers have to look at performance management differently. They have to start looking at the quality of the product, the quality of the work received, and the timeliness and the presentation of the work. So they have to look at other factors. They can't monitor the inputs, they have to monitor the outputs. Now, flexi-time schemes. Well, flexi-time schemes, this is common or commonly used in employment practices and typically involves the employees clocking in and clocking out of work. It's flexi-time. They're on flexi-time. It means they don't have to start at a particular time. They just have to do a certain number of hours per week, let's say. So they clock in to record they're at work and they clock out to say they've now left work. The period they were at work will be totted up to make sure that they do the certain number of hours per week or per month or whatever the contract states. So the employees might be required to record hours on a daily basis, for example on a timesheet, or they might record it on a weekly basis. It depends. It depends on the nature of the tasks and what the system is. The flexi-time scheme usually works on a monthly basis, and employees are required to work for certain hours during the month. For example, they might be asked to work for 160 hours a month. So 40 hours a week, let's say, or 37.5 hours a week, or whatever it is, when you average it out. So they may have to work this number of hours per month, and they need to show that they've worked it. The scheme is referred to as flexible as the manager and the employee work together to arrange how many hours an employee will be present at work. Clearly the managers must be informed when the employee is going to be there so that proper supervision and proper provisions for the worker are made, and that the worker will have a place to work and will have the facilities to do the job. So it's flexible insofar as the employee can pick the hours that he or she wishes to attend, but it must also be done in collaboration with the manager to ensure that the person, when they arrive for work, the requisite tools and equipment or office space or whatever is required is available. Employee hours can be altered to meet demand. Employees can also take certain hours off, providing they make up for the hours later. So if it's flexible, sometimes the workers may be able to leave early. They have informed the manager they will work for 5 hours on a particular day, but there's very little going on and they think, well, they can take the rest of the time off. So inform the manager and perhaps only work 3 hours that day. So it's flexible. So they could actually build up hours and have a day off in the week. It depends on the negotiations with the manager and what the job requires and what the commitment of the worker is and what's needed to be put in. Annual hours. Well, works on the same principle as flexi-time. However, hours are allocated annually rather than monthly. An employee hours are fixed by their manager, and the employee is required to complete those hours when required by the employer. So there's a commitment that so many hours has to be done in the year, and then there's negotiations between the manager and the employee as to when those hours can be done, and what sort of attendance is required. For example, the employees may work more hours when demand is high and less when there is no requirement. So, for example, a company has seasonal demand. Perhaps a company working again in with agricultural produce. So when the harvests come in, there will be a high demand for workers. So the employee might be required to work long hours and over a particular month, or over perhaps even a couple of months. But then, perhaps in January or in February, when nothing much is happening, the worker will have a lot of free time. It's just flexibility. Employee hours can change monthly or seasonally. This is all dependent on demand. However, the employee is required to make up their annual agreed hours. So the company expects the employee to meet the number of hours that they agreed for the year. So sometimes, as I said, if the company's got a high demand, they will expect the workers to work during that period. And when the demand is less, perhaps the workers can have some more time off. The employer will make a loss if an employee leaves work having only worked when demand was low but receives a full wage. So there has to be give and take in this. The company expects the employees to work when there is high demand and to perhaps take their time off when there is less demand. It can also be difficult to predict labour demand. The employer may have to pay for additional staff and overtime when work demand is high. So the employer must look at the order books and try to determine what staffing levels he or she requires, and try to get the workers on annual hours to put in more time during that period and try to meet the requirements of the order book. 0 hours, this became much debated in the UK for a certain period in the 2014 period, 2013 period. 0 hours contracts have gained increasing interest over the past few years. The approach is especially popular with organisations such as Amazon, Royal Mail, UPS, Tesco. There are many organisations who try to have workers on 0 hours. Employees work as and when required by the organisation. There is no fixed contract for employment. So it sounds like the ultimate inflexibility for the organisation. The downside here is, of course, that the workers need the work to earn an income to pay their bills. The workers have to live. So simply having employees on the payroll, or not having employees on the payroll, perhaps is a better way of putting it. Just having the names of the employees and their contact details and call them when required. It sounds like it's a very attractive proposition for the companies. But for the workers who need an income to pay their bills and survive, it may be maybe not that attractive. So the employees are required depending on work demand. This could vary according to seasonal needs, Christmas, Easter, summer and so on. But as I said, the employees would much prefer to have regular incomes so that they can pay their bills and pay for the cost of living. So there is a tension here. It sounds like very flexible and very good on the one hand, but there are issues. They're very unpredictable and not a steady source of income for the employees. And that's the big drawback. The employer usually offers staff training so that employees can work for the organisation when needed. this is on a casual basis. The whole idea of 0 hours is very casual. The employers call the workers when they need them, and when they don't need them, they don't work and they don't get paid. So you can see that it's a very controversial approach. It's very cost effective for organisations, as they don't have to employ full-time staff. But again, as I said, it is controversial. So those are some of the approaches to flexible working. We're going to cover 83, 84 slides thereabouts in this session, so it's worth going back over it, making your own notes and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of each and what's exactly meant by the different types of flexible working methods. But that's all we're going to deal with here, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.